Okay, so today we are going to talk about early childhood and psychosocial development. So we are still in the age range of 2 to 6, but what we see now is that they start to go through what's called emotional regulation or effortful control. So now they have the ability to control their emotions better. They control how they express their emotions better. And this is a huge psychological task for them between the ages of 2 and 6. There are going to be cultural differences, but what we're seeing now is that they can be scared, but they're not completely terrified. So they have a better grasp over their emotions, and they're not going to be throwing tantrums so much anymore. As we start to get near the end of this stage, that tantrum stage should disappear, basically. If your child is 7, 8, 9 and still throwing tantrums, it could be indicative of an emotional disorder. So what influences this emotional regulation is maturation. Of course, the more mature they are, the better impulse control they have. Learning, they can actually come up with strategies for learning, and hopefully we are teaching them the right things to do and the right things to know and when to act one way versus another. And culture, of course. Some cultures, crying is discouraged and you're not supposed to cry and show emotions, while other cultures, it's encouraged to show emotions. So your training, learning, temperament, all of that is going to impact how we can control our emotions, because it's harder for some children to control their emotions than for others. So we are at the Erikson stage, initiative versus guilt. So the third psychosocial crisis. Children are going to undertake new skills and activities, and if they are not successful at them, they're going to feel guilty. So it's basically whether they can acquire emotional regulation, and initiative could mean a lot of things. Initiative could be starting something new. It could mean expanding on an ability that they already have. It could mean that they are expressing a new emotion. So children taking initiative are basically going to have positive outcomes. And when they are not successful or when they're not allowed to take initiatives, they're going to feel guilty. So as parents, we need to make sure that we do not hover over our children and try and do everything for them, because them taking the initiative and learning how to do things is really the only way to be successful. If you hover over them and do everything for them, then you're going to end up having a 20-some-year-old child that you're still doing everything for. In North America, we encourage enthusiasm, effort, and pride. And we try to prevent guilt and encourage feeling joyful. So we want children to do things for themselves. We want them to be excited about doing things for themselves. We want them to put the effort behind it, take pride in what they do. And the end result is to prevent any guilty feelings, even if they're not successful at everything they do. And to, of course, encourage joy. So parents basically need to guide these emotions. They need to teach emotional regulation through guidance. You don't want to be brutally honest here. You want to let them dream. If they draw you a picture, for example, and it's the worst picture you've ever seen in your life, you don't want to be brutally honest and tell them this is the worst picture you've ever seen in your life, because then they're going to start to feel ashamed and guilty. You want to tell them that it's a good picture and they made a good effort and still hanging on the fridge. So we want to encourage them to be their own people and take the initiative. So pride is going to include gender, size, heritage. So taking pride in whether you're male, female, transgender, taking pride in where you come from. Make sure you're happy who you are. And we want to encourage that at a young age. We want girls to be happy to be girls, boys to be happy to be boys. We want these children to be glad that they're getting older. We want them to take pride in doing things. And, we want to encourage them to be proud of who they are, regardless of who they are. And that's a very important thing. We do not want children growing up not feeling proud of who they are, regardless of who that is. Even if it is a transgender child and they know at the age of 6, we want to encourage them to be who they are. Prejudice often involves feelings of superiority to children of other sexes, nationalities, or religions. So we do not want our children to be prejudiced. We do not want our children to think they're better than anybody else, because that's going to lead to problems later in life. Again, neurological advances, you have that growth of the prefrontal cortex right in the front at about 4 or 5. So we're having the growth of the area that controls our planning and our impulses. So it's starting to mature. You have myelination of the limbic system, which the limbic system, remember, is our emotions. It is not just one thing, it's multiple things. And myelination makes transmission faster. We also have longer attention spans, and they can control themselves better. So the neurological maturation is going to go hand in hand with that longer attention span and the emotional regulation. Their cognitive maturation happens along with their emotional regulation, so they allow each other to advance. So we need to use strategies to help them control any distractions and focus on what we need them to focus on. So we need to encourage that longer attention span, and we need to encourage that self-control. We have 2 different types of motivations. We have intrinsic motivations and extrinsic motivations. Motivations are what propel you to do something. Motivation is why you do what you do. So intrinsic motivations come from inside a person. So it's a reason to pursue a goal, but it's because you want to. It's from inside. So you might finish college because you want to finish college, because you want to, be a better person, kind of thing. And we can see this in imaginary friends and children. Extrinsic motivations are from the outside. So it's a reason to pursue a goal because you want to have achievements rewarded from the outside. So you want to have praise or reinforcement, or you want to make money. So intrinsic, you're doing something for the pleasure of doing it. Like some people like to sing, even though they can't sing, they still enjoy singing. Versus extrinsic, you want to make money for your singing, kind of thing. So the important thing is that we need to praise the effort as opposed to the action or whatever the result is. So what they did is they did some research, and they found that there's a distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. And that distinction is crucial to understand how and when to praise something the child has done, because the effectiveness of praise is actually tied to the praise of a particular production, not the general trait. So specific praise for effort and not a generalized statement. So for example, going back to the picture that the child drew. If the child drew a picture and it's the most hideous thing you've ever seen in your life, you still want to praise their effort. You want to make sure that you say, this was a good job. You really tried hard, kind of thing, as opposed to making a generalized statement. So praise their effort. Make sure that they know that you appreciate their effort. So you don't want to say, you're a good artist, kind of thing. You want to make sure you focus on that particular picture and the effort that they put into that particular picture. Play is the most productive and enjoyable activity that children undertake. It is universal. Every part of the world has play, and it's occurred for thousands of years. The problem is that children do not play as much as they used to play, And recess is becoming one of those things that schools are starting to deem as unnecessary. So children are not getting the activity that they need during the day. Some schools are eliminating recess altogether, which is hard because children, sitting in an academic setting for 8 hours a day all in a row without having a break is straining for them and difficult. They need that recess to kind of unwind and get their energy out and play, in a nutshell. So we have two general kinds of play, solitary and social. Developmentally speaking, most infants are solitary or with their parent. Toddlers start to slowly get better with playmates, and then young children are the best with playmates. So the form of play is going to change with the age, the cohort, and the culture, of course. But we start out playing by ourselves or with our parent, and as we get older, we slowly start to relate to our peers better. So as children grow older, play becomes more social. This again is going to be influenced by maturation of the brain, also by playmate availability in the physical setting. As an infant or even a toddler, you have to rely on your parents to take you to a friend's house or to bring a friend over and have a play date. But as you get older, you have the ability to interact with more children at school and learn, to play with them during recess, hopefully, and then you can have them come over or you can go over. As you're younger, you really don't have that school interaction so much. So maybe you have a daycare interaction, but as they get older, they get more social and become social beings. So this is the daily screen time for U.S. children in 2013 by age. So you can see total screen time is the highest for ages 5 to 8. So as we get older, we get more screen time. We want to be careful that we don't make the TV a babysitter. You don't want to plop your kids in front of the TV and just say, watch TV so you can go about doing whatever you had to do. Because bad things can still happen even if they're just watching TV. So you still want to make sure you supervise them. You want to limit the amount of time that they have in front of TV or computers or their video games and cell phones and whatever. Because the bottom line is, unless they're playing games that help them think, they're just kind of sitting there watching a mindless television program and may oftentimes start snacking on chips and unhealthy things. And that's kind of where the obesity comes in. They're not actively playing outside anymore like they were 50 years ago. And they're eating while they're doing this and eating unhealthy snacks. When I was a kid, wasn't all that long ago, but we used to have open fields that we would go play in. We played outside. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have computers and video games and things like that. So while we had television, we didn't have cable with all of the channels we have now. We didn't have a Cartoon Network and all of that. So we played outside for the most part. We rode our bikes. We were active. Even in the wintertime, we were active. We would play in the snow, have snowball fights, all of that. So even as much as, 40 years ago or so, children used to actively play outside. Now it's gone down significantly. So in 1932, Parton came up with 5 types of play. Now you got to remember this was in 1932, so it was quite some time ago. So solitary play was when a child played alone. They didn't even realize that other children were playing nearby, and they played by themselves, basically. Onlooker play was when a child watches other children play, and this is as they're getting older. So solitary play is about 1, cooperative play is about the age of 6. So onlooker play, they watch other children play. Parallel play is when children play with similar toys, but they don't play together. So you might have children swinging on swings, but not interacting. Associative play is when the children interact a little bit. They start observing each other. They start sharing material. but they're not quite yet at the mutual and reciprocal play yet. Cooperative play is when they're 6, and that's the last turn, where they actually play together and they take turns and they trade. You can play with this toy and I'll play with that toy, and they may actually create some activity that could be rather elaborate. Active play, rough and tumble play, kind of mimics aggression through wrestling, hitting, but there's no intent to harm here. We have expressions and gestures that signify the child is just pretending, so they'll have that play face on, and young males do this often. Advances in children's social understanding can increase, but it also increases the likelihood of getting hurt. When you're play wrestling, even though you're playing, accidents can happen. But active play may positively affect that prefrontal cortex development. So again, we're talking about that maturation where we can plan things out and control our impulses. Sociodramatic play, as the name implies, is when you rehearse social roles, you explore them, you test your ability to explain. You can practice regulating your emotions because you're acting. You'll act out these various roles and themes and stories that they create. So one child will act mad, or another child will have to be sad and cry. Another child may have to act in love, kind of thing. So they'll play out these little roles and actually help them develop a self-concept. So it's actually pretty interesting when you see children play like this. Oftentimes, it kind of builds on their persuasion ability. And most of the time, it's like danger versus good, evil versus good, the good guys versus the bad guys kind of thing. I have to save the princess, that kind of thing. Okay, Baumrin came up with styles of caregiving. And he based parents on 4 different dimensions. Expressions of warmth, so how loving they were versus being cold. Strategies for discipline, whether they were strict or easygoing in punishing and explaining these punishments. Communication, listening versus silence and shutting down. And expectations for maturity. So how responsible and self-controlling you expect your children to be. So using these 3 dimensions, he identified 3 parenting styles. The authoritarian parent has high behavioral standards and strict punishment upon misconduct. There's little communication. So they see themselves as the ultimate authority. They may have physical punishment. There are clear rules, and their word is law, and it's not to be questioned. Permissive parenting is kind of the opposite. They want to be friends with their children. So there's high nurturance and communication, but very little discipline, guidance, or control. So they have low expectations of maturity. They will sit there and listen even if their children are yelling at them and cursing at them. And they let their children get everything they want. So they're very indulgent. Authoritative is kind of in the middle. They set limits and enforce rules, but they are flexible and will stop and listen to what their children have to say. They encourage maturity, but forgive shortcomings. So authoritative parents are guides. So they want to guide their children through life. Sternberg presented a 4th style, a neglectful, uninvolved parent, which they're indifferent towards their children and unaware of what's going on in their children's lives. So their children basically do whatever they want. So what they found were that children of authoritarian parents tended to become obedient and quiet and conscientious, but not exactly happy. They would feel depressed and blame themselves if something goes wrong. They'd feel guilty. They tend to leave home before the age of 20 and are very rebellious as adolescents. So it's like their parents are the authority for their whole lives, so finally when they get old enough, they feel as if they can rebel against the authority. Children of permissive parents tend to lack self-control, especially in peer relationships, and they're not really happy. They do not know how to regulate their emotions, and they're very immature and do not have a lot of friends. They will continue to live at home and be dependent on their parents into early adulthood. And this is because they've always gotten everything they've wanted their whole lives. They've been spoiled to an incredible extent. So they throw tantrums and get what they want. They can yell at their parents and still get what they want. So they've never been shown how to regulate their emotions, and they don't have self-control because they've never been punished. Children of authoritative parents tend to be successful and happy with themselves. They're articulate and generous, and they're well liked by teachers and peers. So children of authoritative parents seem to turn out the best. Children of neglectful and involved parents are immature, sad, and lonely, and they have lifelong risks of injury and abuse from themselves and from looking for relationships where abuse will be prominent. They feel like they deserve it and don't try to get out. There are some critiques, though. The original sample that he looked at had little economic, ethnic, or cultural diversity. So everybody was basically from the same culture, the same ethnicity, and the same station in life. So it wasn't like they had a sampling of poor people, medium, middle-income people, old people, young people, rich people. They didn't have any diversity whatsoever. They also focused more on the attitudes than on daily interactions. They didn't give recognition to the fact that some authoritarian parents are actually very loving towards their children. So even though they look at themselves as the ultimate authority, they still show a lot of love to their children. They also didn't recognize that some permissive parents guide their children intensely with words. So they talk to them. They don't have rules and regulations that they have to follow, but they do talk to their children and have conversations with their children in order to guide them. And finally, they overlooked the child's contribution to the parent-child relationship. They didn't take into account that parents have different types of relationships with their children, and that children also have to kind of give back to have a relationship with their parents. You can't be an authoritative parent and willing to talk to your children and compromise if your child's not ready to do that and not willing to do that. So even though you might want to be an authoritative parent, you may end up having to be an authoritarian parent because they didn't look at how the child contributes to the parent-child interaction. It's not just the parents. The child is the other half of the equation, and they didn't consider that. So before the age of 2, children know whether they are boys or girls and can apply these gender labels consistently. And by the age of 4, children are convinced that certain toys, such as dolls and trucks, are appropriate for one gender but not the other. So they think that boys play with trucks and girls play with dolls, and that's it, and that's the only way it can be. But there's a difference between sex and gender. Sex are the biological differences between males and females. So organs, the penis versus the vagina, ovaries versus testes, hormones, testosterone versus estrogen, and body shape. These are all sex differences that are biological. Gender differences are differences in behaviors and roles that are historically applied to males and females. So initially there's confusion about gender and sex. By age 5, they have an increased awareness of the differences between gender and sex. By age 8, they believe that their biological sex is a permanent trait. So from 2 to 8, they are aware of these sex differences. They will actually play with same-sex playmates and will do stereotypical gender activities. So Freud comes in with his psychoanalytical theory. We're at the phallic stage, which is his 3rd stage of development. According to Freud, the penis becomes the focus of concern and pleasure during this stage. And this is where the Oedipus complex and Electra complex can come into play. The Oedipus complex is the desire unconsciously of young boys to replace their fathers because they're in love with their mothers. The Electra complex is the opposite. The girls want to replace their mothers because they're in love with their fathers. Now, not resolving this complex, he believed, is what leads to unhealthy relationships between boys and their mothers and girls and their fathers. And it's actually been given as a reason for some daughters killing their mothers and boys killing their fathers. Identification is when you consider the behaviors, appearance, and attitudes of someone else to be one's own. So you try to become like that parent. You try to become like the same-sex parent. Behaviorists, of course, look at it differently. So gender differences are a product of this reinforcement and punishment, and they're all learned through roles, values, and morals. So if you go with boys are supposed to play with trucks and girls are supposed to play with dolls, if the parent would punish them for playing, if a parent would punish a boy for playing with a doll, or give a girl a reward for playing with a doll kind of thing, that's going to reinforce or punish that gender difference. They're going to start looking at their roles differently. But the bottom line is roles have changed over time. And before, 50, 60 years ago, the female had the role of taking care of the household and the male had the role of going out and making the money. But now that's completely changed, and often we have dual income families, so both parents are working. Gender appropriate behavior is rewarded more frequently than gender inappropriate behavior. So a boy asks for a truck and a doll, and he's given a truck because that's gender appropriate. Social learning theory is, again, we take how other people act into account. So children notice the ways that men and women behave and kind of internalize those standards. So girls like to hug more than boys do, in a nutshell. Piaget and his cognitive theories. Cognitive theory offers an alternative explanation for the gender identity that comes around age 5. They call it a gender schema, which is a child's cognitive concept or general belief about the differences in sex. It's based on their own observations and experiences. So young children will categorize themselves and everyone else as either a male or a female, and then they think and behave like the male or female is supposed to think and behave. So girls wear pink dresses, boys do not. Pink is for girls, blue is for boys, that kind of thing. Humanism with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Children are striving for admiration from their peers. So they want admiration from their peers more than love from their parents. So young children try to belong by conforming to these gender norms. And that's often where we have a problem, because some children are feeling differently, like they don't fit into these gender norms, but they feel like they have to force themselves to fit in. Evolutionarily speaking, again, reproduction and survival and perpetuation of the species. So sexual attraction is crucial for that basic urge to reproduce. So girls are going to try to look like girls, boys are going to try to look like boys, and boys and girls are going to practice becoming attractive to the opposite sex. So girls will practice wearing makeup and perfume. Boys will try making their hair whatever the popular style is and wearing the right cologne, dressing the right way. Moral development is a very important thing. Emotional and social maturation are the foundations for this. So nature and nurture are going to kind of interact, but of course developmentalists disagree on what is more important. Nature, again, being what you're born with. Nurture, the culture that you've been born with and brought up with. So nature are your genes, your biology. So they say that morality is a genetic outgrowth of the bonding, attachment, and cognitive maturation. So your genes are in control of how fast you mature and what kind of attachments and bonds you make. Nurture is saying that culture is crucial to the development of morality because it's how you're brought up that make you who you are. The bottom line is that both of them interact equally to form your morals. And your moral foundation is important because some people do not really have any morals, while others hold themselves to a high standard of morality. Pro-social versus antisocial behavior. Pro-social behavior is when you're extending helpfulness and kindness. You feel empathy, so there's no benefit to yourself, and this increases with maturity. So in that picture, the little girl is patting the other little girl who's crying on the back, trying to comfort her. Antisocial is when you deliberately hurt another person, including innocent people that have done nothing to you, and it's antipathy. This declines with maturity. So as you're maturing, your good behavior and kindness should go up, and your deliberately harming somebody should go down. And antisocial is that little boy pinching that other little boy's face, probably for no reason at all. We have 4 general types of aggression: instrumental, reactive, relational, and bullying. Instrumental is hurtful behavior to get something someone else has. 2-year-olds will often do this. They will be aggressive towards another child who has a toy that they want, and they'll just grab it out of the boy or girl's hand. Reactive is reaction to aggression. So if somebody's being aggressive towards you, they might punch them in the face, kind of thing. Relational is non-physical, but you hurl insults and spread rumors about people in order to ruin their other relationships. And then bullying is unprovoked verbal or physical. Repeated attacks, that's the key. Repeated attacks. And it's basically to dominate. You usually pick people that are less stronger than you. You're stronger than them. Weaker than you, that's what I was looking for. And you repeatedly attack them to gain dominance over them. So all forms of aggression usually become less common between the ages of 2 to 6 because your brain matures and your empathy is going to increase. So you start to understand what other people are going through. Children will learn to use aggression selectively, and that's going to decrease the victims and aggression. So in the U.S., children are spanked, slapped, or beaten more often than children, and more often than other children, and more often than children in Canada and Western Europe. In general, it's more frequent by mothers than fathers. It's more among African Americans than European Americans, which are more than Asian Americans. In the U.S., low SES, it's more than high SES. And U.S.-born Hispanics more than immigrant Hispanics. But each family is going to be different. So spanking your children, it depends on if it goes to an extreme or not. So that's really the key. You want to make sure that you're not beating your children because that's not healthy for anybody. That is abuse. But again, in general, the U.S. is higher on the spanking list. So is spanking okay? Opinions are influenced by past experience and cultural norms, of course. Some researchers say that it's harmless. Others say it's very harmful. Physical punishment increases obedience temporarily, but it also increases the possibility of aggression later. And it correlates with delayed theory of mind and increased aggression. But again, some researchers say that physical punishment doesn't hurt the children. Others say it does hurt the children. So it really comes into play to be your own beliefs. When I was a child, we were spanked, and it was a normal thing. Everybody whooped their children. Other parents had permission to whoop you if you misbehaved at their house. But now, as time is going on and children are crying abuse, even when it's not, some parents are afraid to even spank their children or anything even close to that. So I guess it really depends on your personal beliefs, as long as it doesn't go into abusive. Other forms of punishment, timeout, that was a big one for me. Basically, it's you separate your child from other people for a specified period of time. So I would give my kids timeouts when they misbehaved. Psychological control is a disciplinary technique, and it's not healthy because you threaten to withdraw love and support. And the child really relies on you for love and support, and you threaten to withdraw that and tell them you're not going to love them anymore if they don't do this, which is just horrible. And induction is an alternative to both physical punishment and psychological control. It's basically when you give them a timeout, and then after you give them a timeout, you talk to them extensively about what they did, why they did it, do they know it was wrong, why do they know it was wrong, and make sure that they have a clear understanding and they're calmed down while you can explain and have a conversation with them. Now, clearly, this is only going to work if the child is old enough to understand what's going on. So, again, everything's different. Situations are different. Harm reduction is just reducing the negative consequences of behavior. Of course, we don't want to harm our children. That chart shows you lead concentration in blood of children ages 6 and under in the US and how it's gone down over the years. Lead used to be used in paint, and children would eat the paint chips and end up with lead poisoning. An accident is a random, unpredictable injury. So lead poisoning, of course, was one. It's called plumism. And injuries from cars and trucks was another. Now we have regulations like seat belts, car seats, and airbags that kind of reduces the harm that's done. Child maltreatment is defined as the intentional harm to or avoidable endangerment of anyone under 18. Substantiated maltreatment is harm or endangerment that's been reported, investigated, and verified. And reported maltreatment is harm or endangerment about which someone has notified the authorities. So the difference is child maltreatment is you're intentionally hurting someone under the age of 18. Substantiated maltreatment is that maltreatment has been reported, investigated, and verified. And reported is just it's been reported, it hasn't been investigated and verified yet. Somebody's reported it. So you have child maltreatment, which is the actual act. Reported maltreatment, which is when someone reports that to authorities. And substantiated maltreatment is after it's been reported, investigated, and verified. If you suspect maltreatment of children, it's very important to get it reported because they will investigate, and if there's nothing there, they'll drop it. If there is, they will verify it. So it's very important to protect our children. The frequency of maltreatment, we have a 5-to-1 ratio of reported versus substantiated cases because every child is only counted once. So you could have 10 acts of maltreatment against that one child, but it counts as one. Substantiation requires proof. You can't just say somebody, beat a child without having some kind of proof behind it. You have to have that proof. Mandated reports are required signs of possible maltreatment. So again, you have to report it. They have to have signs of this maltreatment. Some reports are also screened out. Some reports don't even get looked at. Some reports are deliberately false, which is also a bad thing. You don't ever want to falsely accuse somebody of maltreatment of a child. That could completely destroy someone's life if it is not true. So the total numbers have gone down between 2000 and 2011, but it's still a bad thing, and we still need to make sure we get this under control. We have to protect the children. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. Some maltreated children suffer from PTSD, and they actually have neurological, emotional, and behavioral damage. PTSD is often seen in soldiers coming home from war. And maltreated children, unfortunately, can suffer from this very easily because it's a stressful event, so that could impact their development. And they may not know how to handle situations. And they may grow up and still remember being mistreated, basically. So PTSD is a bad thing that children who were mistreated can suffer from, just as much as soldiers coming home from war can suffer from. And it's a real thing. And it's hard to understand it unless you're going through it. So, mistreated and neglected children often regard people as hostile and exploitative, so they think everybody's out to use them. They're usually less friendly, more aggressive. They're more isolated than other children. They experience greater social deficits because they do not know how to act in social settings. And they may experience enduring economic consequences because it may affect their future work. So how do we prevent? Primary prevention is focusing on the macro system and exosystem. So we need to change the overall background conditions. So we put stop signs in and sidewalks. Secondary prevention is focusing on the warning signs and the intervention. So seatbelts to avert harm, car seats to make sure the children are safe, that kind of thing. And tertiary prevention is focusing on everything that limits harm after maltreatment has already occurred. So after maltreatment has occurred, get them immediate and effective medical treatment, have penalties for hit and run drivers, penalties for child abusers, stricter penalties for child abusers. And, the bottom line is we can only do so much, but we have to try to do what we can to protect our children. And if you're a parent or ever a parent or going to be a parent, you should only be a parent if you want to be a parent. If you think the children are going to be pains in the butt and you really don't want children, then stop it from happening. Protect yourself and just don't have children. Not everybody's cut out to be a parent, and that's the bottom line. Some people do not handle stress very well and may take it out on their children. So we have to make sure that responsible people are having children, and that if you're going to have a child, you can be responsible and protect that child. So that is all for today. We will talk about Chapter 7, which we're moving to middle childhood, next time. Bye.